So, as indicated by the latest chapter of the manga, My Hero Academia's once long awaited war arc has finally concluded. We made it, guys. It has really and truly been one hell of a ride. And because so many of you have shared the weekly experience with us, we figure a recap of all that has transpired is in order, as a solid understanding of the past may lead to more solid predictions for the future. And speaking of the future, we are doing our damnedest to make sure we are in yours. As of late, the official Plot Armor Twitter and Instagram pages have been reborn to bring you more of the anime and manga greatness that you've come to expect from us, which now includes all the latest news surrounding the various series that we love, so that even beyond YouTube, Plot Armor has you covered. Check us out at Plot Armor YT. But with that being said, how about we cover the topic of this video? Well, despite the war arc officially beginning with chapter 258, it was a few chapters prior, with 245, that thanks to the diligence of Hawks and his involvement with the villains, the #1 hero Endeavor was warned of the impending threat via encoded text. Which is to say that this war in of itself was a preemptive strike on the part of the heroes to avoid the truly unstoppable destruction the Paranormal Liberation Front had been preparing for. The situation being so precarious, in fact, that although the Public Safety Commission had been preparing in secrecy, they had Hero Corps students across the country be brought into the field with professional heroes in order to gain experience against real villains over the course of the 4 months that they had to prepare. 4 months being just before Shigaraki would emerge in a more perfected form. From there, the villains planned to cull all heroes from the country, presumably including hero hopefuls as well. All major cities would be dealt horrific blows, leading to a state of lawlessness wherein their more charismatic members would claim the political world. They would then provide mass-produced weapons to the populace in promotion of self-defense, all in hopes of leading to a state of the world very much like when quirks first came into prominence and the laws just could not keep up. And in all this chaos, Shigaraki would arise as a king of it all, as the second coming of All for One. And so as spring break was just about to end, all the Class 1A students suddenly realized that they all had trips planned for their work studies on the same day, which was the day that would change all their lives forever. Our focus begins with Jaku General Hospital and its founder, Kyūdai Garaki. Believed to be quirkless, Garaki was described to be a whimsical yet charitable man that promoted community-based quirk medicine, gaining him the respect of many. But thanks to a tip-off from the Public Safety Commission, he was caught with a miniature Nomu in 4K, and so the heroes knew that they had their guy. And by the way, this is the same hospital and man that discovered Deku's quirklessness. However, that does not necessarily imply that a quirk was stolen from Deku. In fact, it's more likely that one wasn't, considering the delicacy of the overall process, but I digress. The sensitivity of the situation made it so that the heroes needed to strike simultaneously across the board. Now, with the possession of Johnny the Warp Quirk Nomu, the various high-end Nomu, and the incubating Shigaraki, the hospital battle needed to be successful no matter what, which is why the likes of Endeavor, Wash, Crust, Midako, Ryukyu, and Eraserhead were all made to go here. And at that, they would easily make their way to Dr. Garaki, giving him reason to flee. But with the activation of the Erasure quirk, it would be revealed that Garaki was in fact not quirkless and actually possessed the very same age-defying quirk that had kept All for One alive for so very long, leading True Man to deduce that beyond the Nomu, the technology the Doctor provided to All for One was that of artificial quirk replication. It was believed then that they may be able to win the battle without shedding a single drop of blood on account of the Nomu's necessity for instruction. Midako, the number 5 rabbit hero, would then break her way through the morgue and into the nefarious doctor's lab, as any hope of avoidance would simultaneously break down, as several Nomu abomination would jettison from the ground and begin their assault. The doctor the heroes had captured was a replicate produced by the double quirk of Twice, as apparently this double had been handling Garaki's day-to-day business for months, as Garaki proper was busy focusing on Shigaraki. Here, we would see the life's work of the Doctor, a laboratory filled to the brim with replicated and stolen quirks, and several high-end Nomu still in the testing phase. But even still, Shigaraki was to be his greatest work and masterpiece, and so he would rush over to Johnny as a means of escape, while Midako absolutely destroyed any and all Nomu before her in a single jaunt, destroying countless collected quirks and the ever-useful Johnny unintentionally in one fell swoop. Making a mess of the place, she also killed off some high-end Nomu with the same move. As above, the rest of the heroes on the scene would engage in fights of their own, and the number 6 hero, Crust, was also facing some Nomu on his way into the morgue. Midako would begin her assault on the doctor, who'd think to unleash the high-end Nomu despite knowing them to have been untested, requiring several hours to truly stabilize. But Midako is an absolute beast and just swept in to break his arm, but would be thwarted by Mocha, a little Nomu with a copy of the double quirk possessed by Twice. From there, the high-end Nomu would arise and the doctor would begin to flee. The fight between Midako and the high-ends was beyond savage, and although she was able to kill one, she did end up losing her left arm. They'd go on fighting like this for some time, but eventually the high-ends would begin to adapt and stabilize, to the point where Midako just wasn't landing her hits anymore. But the sheer fact that she was able to hold her own against several of these creatures at once for 5 whole minutes is unreal, and definitely serves to place her amongst the strongest characters of the entire series. But in realizing her own predicament, Midako would do the dash. But rather than running to safety, she would run towards Shigaraki to stop his incubation, making this one of the most heroic moments in the series, as she would be pierced and cut into all over as she drew close. But just then, the number 1 hero Endeavor would join the fight. The likes of Eraserhead, Present Mike, and Crust would now fight against the high-end horde, as Midako would do it. The tank would shatter, but it wasn't entirely destroyed. With Endeavor taking her to safety, it was clear just how severe her injuries were, as he would then have to cauterize her wounds to keep her alive. And just as the doctor decided to awaken Shigaraki, Present Mike would finish what Midako started, as his loud voice would break everything, and in honor of his fallen friend who had been taken advantage of, would punch the doctor right across his face. Following this, Shigaraki's heart would stop, and the heroes would flood in to kill the remaining high-end Nomu. From there, we shift our attention to the mountain team. Here, a grand collective of heroes would come together to face the villains while their commanders were still having a meeting. Now, while the backline was made up of heroes in training, the front lines would actually have a few students whose quirks were deemed to be particularly useful in this context. With that, the heroes would begin their charge, as Cementos would in an instant break the estate apart and expose it to interior assault. The battle would then commence, where not a single villain was to be able to escape. Meanwhile, secretly inside the estate, Hawks would make his move against Twice. He believed Twice to be the single greatest threat to their victory and deemed him a target of particular interest, a betrayal that took Twice by surprise and shook him to his core. However, Hawks offered him an eventual fresh start because even he knew that Twice was a good person at heart. But Twice would refuse, questioning if Hawks truly believed himself to be a hero. Hawks expressed that he did not want to fight, but Twice expressed that he did not give a damn. He was more than willing to give his soul in exchange for the happiness of the League. Twice would then make double after double, but it was futile. Hawks would destroy them just as fast. He had no chance. But just then, blue flames would flood into the room. Dabi was here. Apparently, he never believed Hawks from the beginning. And although Hawks was up against his natural weakness and had lost the majority of his feathers, his speed was still in a league of its own, as he'd make his way to and fatally stab Twice in the back. However, just before he died, Twice managed to let off a double. This double would manage to make it to Toga and Mr. Compress, killing a hero in the process. It was then that he would give his final goodbye. His final words being an apology, as he would fall apart in Toga's arms. But the fight between Dabi and Hawks wasn't over just yet. Somehow Dabi knew the secret identity of Hawks and when asked would provide his identity as well, adding that more than anyone else, Hawks should have been keeping his eyes on him, as he would then continue to stomp Hawks out before Tokoyami would come to his aid, the two just barely making it out with their lives. Shifting yet again, we have the mental scape of Shigaraki. Here, he would see his family again through his destruction-filled memories, then being beckoned by All For One to accept his power and approach. But as he did this, his family would hold onto him. Shimura in particular, his grandmother, telling him to never forget. But he would disregard this and continue forth, telling them not to reject who he is. As a symbol of fear, Shigaraki would arise. The city team at this point hadn't encountered any dangers and were instead evacuating residents down to the animals, as it was to be a counter-villain battle zone momentarily. But just then, Deku would hear the voice of the first possessor. Shigaraki was coming, and it was up to Deku to stop him. Mass decay would begin, the entire lab would break away, and the heroes would begin rushing to escape. But during this, a high-end Nomu would grip onto Eraserhead, intending to take him down as well. But then, it would happen. Crust would save him by sacrificing his own life with a smile and a thumbs up. Everything would be destroyed, with some unfortunate heroes getting caught up in the wave of destruction. Shigaraki's awakening would level everything. It would then get to Deku and company, who would then do everything they could to save civilians and get to safety. Shigaraki then calling on Giganto Machia to bring everyone to him, as Endeavor would immediately confront the man. This fight was ridiculous. Shigaraki would begin to get a feel for the quirks collected by All For One, as he boasted absurd levels of regeneration. Yet, he wasn't satisfied. What he needed was One For All, and unfortunately he could sense exactly where it was. And with Deku knowing himself to be the primary target, he would rush off away from the others, with Bakugo now following along. Now, because nobody knew what the hell One For All was, Endeavor was very confused why Deku of all people would be the target, but Deku promised to explain later, as Shigaraki would rush towards his direction immediately, catching up to the two just as quickly as an overwhelming fear of death would consume them. But luckily, Gran Torino would then be there just in the nick of time to save them. Meanwhile, Eraserhead would keep his eyes trained on Shigaraki, keeping him from using his various quirks. Shigaraki then telling his minions to kill every person that they see. The fighting would continue, and Shigaraki would just continue to strike fear into the hearts of everyone, because even with Eraserhead looking at him, his body modifications were major enough to be reminiscent of All Might himself, as he would then strike the pose of All Might while standing atop Endeavor and Ryukyu. Meanwhile, a horde of near high-end Nomu would come to life. Shigaraki would then begin to target Eraserhead for obvious reasons, but Deku and Bakugo would not let that happen, as they would enter the fray as well, despite Deku being Shigaraki's target as well. From here, they would then all gang up on Shigaraki and give him all that they've got. And in the midst of this, Shigaraki's face would begin to split as the voice of All For One would leak out, speaking of One For All and his little brother, to the surprise of Shigaraki and Deku. The will of All For One was strong, but Shigaraki would reject it. And again, blow after blow, the fighting would continue. Now going back to the mountain team, everyone would do their best to stop Giganto Machia from leaving the scene. And in trying to do so, Midnight would become severely injured and unable to move. Because of this, she would communicate to Momo that power isn't something they can depend on to take Machia down, that they need to put him to sleep. Meanwhile, several villains would begin to converge on her. Her final words being to Momo that she trusts her judgment, as she thought to herself what a fine leader that girl will be one day. With this, Momo would take charge and create a number of sedatives for her comrades. Then, using most of the combined quirks of Class 1A, 1B, and Shiketsu High, they would challenge Giganto Machia, and actually get him to fall. But sadly, this would only last for a moment as Giganto Machia was able to literally blow them all away. However, this opportunity would allow Mount Lady to keep the behemoth's mouth open as these students would charge in. And with that, Kirishima would be able to scale the beast and manage to get the sedative in his mouth. Back to Shigaraki, the fighting would intensify. Gran Torino would be taken down. Following that, Shigaraki would flick the quirk-destroying drug at Eraserhead with more force than a loaded pistol, as before it could spread, without hesitation, Eraserhead would cut off his own leg. And in the very moment that he flinched due to the pain, Shigaraki would begin to peel his face off before being thwarted by the introduction of Shoto to the fight. From there, bad would only become worse as Giganto Machia would make his way through various cities towards his master. And at a certain point throughout all the fighting, Shigaraki would recognize that his rebirth was premature and his body was certainly struggling to keep up. For this reason, he would seek to end it all with mass decay. And in reaction to this, Deku would finally use the quirk Float while bringing everyone else up with Black Whip, something that he had trained with some of his classmates while maintaining the secret of One for All. And at this point, he was just beating the brakes off of Shigaraki. But with this level of damage output, he was running the risk of losing permanent use of his arms. But he did not care. He would not stop. He could not stop, because that's what this power was made for. He was giving it his all and then some, plus ultra. But when Deku least expected it, Shigaraki would lash out with several tendrils towards him, and with this, in an instant, Bakugo's quirk would awaken, allowing him to make it over there, pushing Deku out of harm's way and instead sacrificing himself. A sequence of events that caused Deku to lose all sensibility as he went berserk towards his enemy, as the very face of Shigaraki would split apart to reveal that of All For One, who was smiling, then gripping onto Deku as we would enter the world of One For All. Here, All For One would attempt to coerce Shigaraki into obedience, as the spirit of Shimura would come to Deku's aid as he himself could not yet move in this space. A battle of will would then ensue for control over One For All, as even the first user would join in, speaking to his brother. All For One then speaking at length about just how worthless Deku is and how he is their greatest mistake. But the first possessor would deny this and say that they believed in him to the utmost degree, as Deku would lunge forwards and the two would be repelled from one another. Now, before Machia made it to the battlefield, Toga would leave in search of Uraraka, as the death of Twice left her with some questions she was then able to find the answers to. And at this point, Shigaraki and All For One just could not agree, and it was a mess. One that Nejire and Ida would join in on just before Machia and the League would do the same. Now, as this fighting was going on, a broadcast would make its way across the country. The confession of Dabi, or should I say Toya Todoroki, as he would unveil the truth to Endeavor and Shoto's dismay. Suddenly, Endeavor would fail to move an inch, but another top hero would act in his place, as Best Jeanist would enter the battle as well, subduing the villains with his threads. But he wasn't the only one, as Mirio would come to play as well, having had his quirk recently restored by Eri. With a flock of Nearhai and Nomu now on the scene too, because at this point everyone was just joining in, they would all fight like crazy. And just as Machia began to rampage yet again, the sedative from earlier would finally kick in, and he was down for the count. In realizing their predicament, Mr. Compress would sacrifice his own flesh for that of his friends. And at some point, Deku passed out but would awaken to realize that he had awakened the quirk of the fourth user, Danger Sense. But with the opportunity provided by Mr. Compress, Shigaraki would awaken once more, this time with All For One in charge, as the Nearhai and Nomu would rush into their rescue, leaving Mr. Compress and Giganto Machia behind, as he would swear to see Deku again once Shigaraki's body was perfected. And the heroes would try their best to stop Shigaraki's escape to no avail. Elsewhere, the heroes, despite the looks of things, did emerge largely victorious, having apprehended nearly 17,000 individuals. However, over 100 were still at large, And in the end, Shigaraki's desire for destruction cost society severely that day in ways that can never truly be undone. And so where things go from here will surely be interesting to behold, because it doesn't seem like we're slowing down at all. Let us know what you thought about this arc in the comments. It was all levels of crazy, and so I can only imagine what Horikoshi has in store for us next. Be sure to subscribe to Plot Armor, because we will be covering all of that and more. And if you want even more, head on over to our Patreon page where we cover even more anime and manga, even Korean ones. This year is set to have a whole lot of interesting anime come out, so you won't want to miss out on our unfiltered reactions. Because when it comes to bringing you some of the best My Hero Academia content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.